Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our Producers Talk Story Media Fund Q&A. I'm Kaylee Dillon, the Program Manager at Pacific Islanders and Communications. And joining me today, we have Kimberlee Bassford. Kimberlee is an independent documentary filmmaker from Hawaii with a background in journalism. And she's currently in production on her second PIC-funded film entitled Sia, about Samoan novelist Sia Figel. And also joining us, we have Christen Marquez. Christen is a Hawaiian director and producer who was born in Honolulu, but moved to the continental US at the age of 8. And she is currently in production also on her second PIC-funded film, that is entitled The Ninth Island, about Native Hawaiians who have to look outside of the islands, namely to the ninth island of Las Vegas, to find a place to call home. So thank you both so much for being with us today, and for being here to discuss the media fund with us and to lend some of your expertise.
Yeah,
so
excited.
Together,
yeah, thanks for having us. It's fun to be here.
Great. So together we'll be discussing each part of the Media Fund application. I'll briefly guide us through and then really give Kim and Christen the opportunity to share their advice and experience as to how they approach each requirement. And we're also here to answer any questions you might have as you either started filling out the application or as you're looking ahead to applying. So this is a good time to remind everyone that the Media Fund applications are currently open. And we have an extended deadline of July 24th. So you can access the portal to the application as well as very detailed information about all of the application pieces required, all on our website. So we'll add that link to the chat window here on the right, so that you can access it. And also, if you have a question that comes up as we're talking, please feel free to chime in, also using the chat or comment feature here on the window. And then lastly, this discussion will be recorded, so we'll have it posted, available on our website and on our YouTube channel in the coming week, if you want to revisit it or to share it. So first, to kick it off, let's start with what type of projects the Media Fund is for. So we offer production and post-production funding up to $50,000 for standalone nonfiction documentary projects about the Indigenous Pacific Islander experience. And these are all for public media broadcast. And at PIC, we define Pacific Islander as descendants of the indigenous peoples of Hawaii, Guam, American Samoa, the Northern Marianas, and other Pacific islands of Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. So if you have any questions or for more information about project qualifications, you can also visit the Media Fund page on our website. And as far as the process for reviewing applications go, just briefly, we compile an independent review panel that is made up of filmmakers, cultural advisors, public television executives, and others working in related fields. And they'll read through all of the applications and provide comments on each, as well as funding recommendations. So that is all to say, be sure to be really thorough in these applications. The information that you provide is all that the panelists have to go on. So if you've spoken to me about your project or someone else at PIC, just make sure that that any reader will know what you're talking about and understand your vision, because ultimately the review panel is the one who will be recommending your project. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in to talk about application pieces. Okay, so we have 9 components of this application, and the first one is a really big one. It's the project description. This has a number of subcomponents to it: the synopsis, the treatment, the filmmaker's statement, the topic summary, and the artistic approach. Again, you can reference the website for particulars on each of these. But the main point of it is really to tell us what your story is, and let us see into your vision as far as how the story will play out. So, I think this piece can be a pretty daunting one, just to start to formulate and put together. So, Kristen and Kim, do you have any advice on how you approach this piece or where you begin?
Are you talking about the entire project description?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like to start with a treatment, because that's sort of the bulk of it, right? It's about up to 7 pages in length, and then the treatment can be up to 4 pages. So the treatment is really, for me, sort of a written visual version of the story that you imagine on the screen. And in sort of fleshing out the story, I think then you can write your synopsis and talk about your topic and everything else. So I always start with the treatment personally, and I always think about the treatment as telling a story. So I really try and figure out how can I best tell this story using words, but making it as visual as possible, and making sure I'm hitting all the main story elements like character, setting, plot, and tension. And then also making sure in the amount of space I have to write it that I'm giving a sense of the structure of the film as I initially, envision it at this point in time.
Yeah, I agree. I would start.
Absolutely, those are all really good.
Yeah, it's the bulk of the. I think it's probably the thing that weighs the most on the panelists' radar, because especially, for first-time filmmakers or people who aren't maybe coming into and making a film with PIC for the first time, that's where they're going to be able to see, that you can kind of like tell a narrative arc, that you have a good sense of your characters, have a good sense of the world that you're in. But I think, Kim covered that idea of like that the treatment is really important and just like focusing in on the story and the point of view of your film. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about those other pieces because they are important. Like I kind of like to think of this whole project description segment almost like each of those things can kind of feed into other pieces of the whole application. Like with your topic summary, like in some ways I kind of think of it as like a framework for you to kind of like explain your overall approach of, why you're, like I put here, it's like, because I made some notes before I came on, it's like, why does your audience want to watch this film? What are the challenges and the stakes of the questions that you're addressing through this project? And then, in that topic summary, it's kind of like setting it up to explain like who your audience is. So a lot of like what I do in the project description, I try to like expand and like not think of it as like exactly an isolated piece of an application, but as almost like a springboard to kind of like inform later pieces of these other of the project or of the application, the 2 through 9 that come later.
That's a great point. So something that that will come up, I think, throughout as we talk about each of these components is how important it is that there's consistency among all of them. So each piece, as you were saying, is going to inform the other. That you know, when we start looking into the budget or the timeline, that those things match the scope of the project and the story that you're laying out here in your project description, and that everything goes together and makes sense as a whole. That one person isn't working on one part of the application and another on another part, and then feeling like there's a ball that's been dropped in between. So that's a great point. And another question that we get fairly often, especially with documentary, is that it is kind of like, how do you know how it's going to end? So how can I tell you the beginning, middle, and end of the story? And that, you know, obviously none of us have a crystal ball, we're not psychic, but at the same time, being able to, you know, with your best guess and estimate as to the research you've done and how you are approaching this story, to show us that you have a full arc in mind, and kind of a landing place, so the film will end one day and there will be some sort of resolution to your arc. And Kim, I know this has come up for you actually in the project that you're currently working on.
Definitely. So both of my PIC-funded films were Veritate films, and the one I'm on now is a Veritate film. And it's exactly what Kaylee was saying. You sort of write based on what you expect to happen, based on all the information you have at the time. And of course, as you do these applications, your treatment will change because sometimes the trajectory of your character's story changes. But just do the best job, and that's kind of fun sometimes, because you can make Act 3 what you hope Act 3 will be, and in the end, it might be something totally different, and that's okay. But yeah, and if you have started shooting a bunch of things already, another thing I've done sometimes in my treatment is actually inserting quotes from interviews I've already shot with the character. Sometimes, as if you want to use that as a storytelling tool, like actual sound bites from the interviews you've done, you can insert that, because that sometimes will bring the story more to life, to actually have the character sort of speaking for him or herself versus just you writing. So that's another tip, is if you want to include quotes from your characters.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice. Okay. So let's see, moving on to the next component, the second part, which is the work in progress, which you kind of were touching on just a little bit there as far as having some footage shot. So the work in progress can be a trailer, it can be scene selects, or if you're talking about post-production funding, it could be a rough cut of your film. And really what the purpose of this component is to represent the concept of your project, and to make sure that, again, it's in alignment with the rest of the application. So the characters that you've laid out, the story that you've laid out, that this gives some sort of, you know, tangible illustration of those things that you said your story was going to be about. You know, I guess this piece is establishing that you will need to have done some shooting prior to applying. So Christen, when in the process do you build that in for your application?
You're talking about for the, well, if you've, and I see some people asking about R&D, you know, if you've kind of come through R&D, you know, with PIC, I definitely, if I'm applying to R&D for PIC, pretty much all the money from that is going towards creating a work sample. You know, because I think, and this is maybe talking more about like the general documentary funding landscape, less so to PIC, because I think PIC, they are pretty flexible with like how much footage you can have when applying to a production fund. But I would say like that's getting rarer and rarer in the general funding landscape. Like, you know, you guys will accept a trailer, whereas I find now for like production funds in documentary, they almost want like a rough cut of your film. So I think, you know, from the very beginning of like concept of a documentary, I'm thinking of work sample. Like, I think treatment and the treatment portion of the project description and the work sample are like the two most important components of like any documentary proposal. But, you know, the work sample, just because it costs money to make, you know, I think that's what you should be really, you know, focusing, you know, and if you're going out there and you're shooting your own stuff, that's great too. You know, you can kind of hit the ground running and get further along on that work sample. But the work sample is incredibly important. And I think, you know, you're thinking about it from the very beginning of concept, at least to me, if that is kind of what you're asking.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on an important part of this, which is that, you know, if you're considering applying and your project isn't yet in a place where you've laid a solid groundwork for it and you've been able to shoot and start to at least put a concept together for the film, then I would definitely consider looking into R&D funding, which we do offer at PIC. It's on a rolling funding basis, so that does not apply to this deadline. And you can actually reach out and contact me directly. I saw a couple of people had questions about that. If you're interested in learning more about R&D funding, but having taken the time to really do some research and as I said, like lay the groundwork for your project, so that if you receive production funding, you can really hit the ground running. You already know who your characters are. You've secured them. You really have the foundation set up for the film. That's really what we want to see in these applications. So I don't know, Kim, if you have anything else to add about the work in progress and how you think about putting it together.
I guess. Oh.
No, go ahead, Kristen.
Real quick, I'll just say, like, content-wise, because I mean that's just thinking about like where in the process, but content-wise, you know, you want it to be something that's really, you know, if you want to just put your strongest stuff in there, you know, you want to like less is a little bit more, I think, with you know, if you just have a trailer or a few scene selects, you know, you want to show like. And yeah, maybe you just have one really compelling character and you are able to fill in that piece of the treatment and really build out the story through your written component. You know, like those are the two things that really go together. So yeah, just your best stuff forward. You know, if you can put together a really compelling trailer and it's 3 minutes and that's what you have, like, do that. You know, if you have scene selects that are, you know, 2 or 3 powerful scenes, but you kind of want to leave the panelists with a sense of like definitely wanting more, being curious, and that like intrigued, I guess, and just putting your best stuff forward.
I agree with what Kristen said. Definitely, I think the work sample is probably, if you have to choose one component in the application, the most important. But it works hand in hand with the treatment. And in terms of the best stuff, meaning like the most, like the best cinematography, maybe the best sound bites. This is if you're doing a trailer. So that's what I think we mean by the best. And if you're doing more of a scene select, which you can do like a couple of different scenes, I think having the scenes obviously show why your character is compelling and that there are layers to the story within the scene. And then maybe a sense of sort of a beginning, middle, and end to the scene itself. can help to kind of give the panelists an idea that you do know like story structure. But the scenes don't have to be related, and you can just put like a black screen with like, you know, a title card, you know, scene 1, and if there's like a title to the scene, and you can just do that. So you can just string them together. I feel like in my experience that might work better. Sometimes I've sort of tried to string the scenes together, but in a way that wasn't so strong. And I've looked back and I think it would have been better to just make them really discreet, because you don't want to send the panelists sort of the wrong message. So you don't want them thinking that it's like a finished product, like that these scenes actually will connect. So just, you know, keep them discreet is fine, I think.
Yeah. And I guess that's what the other section, it's like the project description in the work in progress sample. You know, you want to use that written piece to set up your viewers to understand what they're looking at. So they don't think like, and using the visual as well of like scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, you know, that, you know, lets them know, yeah, this isn't a sequence that I'm thinking tells a complete story. But, you know, like using that space that you have in terms of like the project description to really set the viewer up for what they're looking at and why you're showing them that, and kind of how it fits into what you think the larger film is. Like that's a good space, and I think like an underutilized space sometimes. Like people might just be like running time 7 minutes or something like that, but you can really put more in there to kind of like inform the viewer, hopefully.
Yes, and that's a good point. So what Kristen is referring to is there's it's basically like a caption section. So when you upload your work in progress, there's also a text box where you can give supporting information about the work in progress. So that's a good point. And then what you're both speaking to as you're talking about like scenes and kind of your best stuff, I think it's also worth kind of highlighting that oftentimes what that will show us is a glimpse into your character, your main character, or characters, and how they appear on screen and how they're going to lead us through some of your story. So yes, everything that you all said, yes.
Yeah, it's hard a little bit to answer that question because there's a lot of tactics you can take. You know, you can do just a straight trailer, or you can do scene selects, but and there's kind of like different strategies, but I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, so moving on, we've got the next component is our timeline. So detail here is really important, as much detail as possible, as far as what you're hoping to accomplish and when. And the major things that we'll be looking for is it realistic, and how likely is the project to be completed if we award it funding. Yeah, basically, is your timeline realistic? Does it make sense with the scope of your project, the budget of your project, and will you complete it? So I don't know, as far as when you're, you know, thinking about like preparing to lay out your timeline, are there certain guideposts that each of you look for to kind of build it around, or where do you begin that process?
Well, in the budget, so the budget and timeline I sort of do together. So I do the timeline first because that obviously informs the budget. And the budget, usually there's like a production section and then a post-production section. So when I think about production, that's filming. So I really think about what are the shoots, like the major shoots that I need to film, and like how many days is each shoot. So I really try to figure out an estimate of all of those numbers. And then that obviously helps figure out the timeline for production. So whether or not, and sometimes it's not like discrete shoots. It might be like in a Veritate film, you don't know exactly how many shoots, but you know you're going to be following the character over the course of 8 months or 12 months. So I kind of figured that out, but I figure, well, on average, I might shoot with her once a week or once a month, and then that'll give me a sense of the number of shoot days, right? And so it is sort of like you really have to get detailed and really just sort of do your best guess at like how many weeks it's going to take to film it. And then the same thing with post-production. And then once you have that, then you can build your budget. It's really hard to build the budget first because you have no idea like how many shoot days you have. So you really have to do the timeline and then the budget. Or at least that's how I do it.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much what I do as well. You know, it's but I think it's good to be specific about like you know, you might have like a large heading like production phase and then break it out by months and then say like for, you know, when these characters move, we're planning on 3 shoot days, you know, to follow that. And then also in the case of like Ninth Island, so I have a filmmaking partner, a directing partner, Kiara, and like she's based in Honolulu and I'm based in Los Angeles. So like, and this, I'm mentioning this because it's like a thing that bleeds into budget, because like, you know, the idea and part of the concept of us partnering up on the film is that she's there to kind of like get the things that are happening on the Hawaii side, and then I'm closer and less, like it's less travel back and forth for us to catch stuff happening on the Vegas side. Like obviously I'm still traveling from Los Angeles, but you know, it's not that ticket back and forth every time. So, you know, when, you know, you're making your timeline and you're talking about travel, you know, or following characters traveling, like it might come up for a panelist in a panelist's mind, like, well, how come they're not budgeting for 8 tickets to match these characters going back and forth? And it's like, so that, you know, explaining that in your timeline, you know, like, oh, well, we have 2 members of our team in 2 separate places that we're planning on, you know. So I guess in a simple way, it's like, are you planning to use local crew, or like, are you flying, or who's flying? You know, that's the stuff that like should be in your timeline. What parts of your crew are flying, that will then make your budget less suspicious. Because I mean, I don't know if this is a bad way to think about it, but I'm always like, that's kind of how, that's my overall approach to the timeline. It's like, how do I make my budget less suspicious to somebody who's like, or less skeptical or eyebrow raising? You don't want like your budget to be like raising red flags of like, well, they're talking about these characters traveling all over the place, but I'm not seeing that reflected in that line item.
Yes, exactly.
And then the other thing with,
we want minimal
no eyebrows.
And the other thing with timelines, so besides the actual filming and editing, which are the major tasks, like don't forget to include things like when you're doing your archival research, if you have archival, when you're, you know, consulting with advisors. I mean, those are all things to include, fundraising, when the crowdfunding campaign is going to be. So like all the parts of your project besides the actual filming and editing, even like the finishing. So, you know, like color correction, sound design, kind of just schedule that into the timeline.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. Oh, there was something you said that just made me think of another point. Maybe it'll come to me later. Okay, so then next up, which we've touched upon a little bit here, but now we're really going to dive into the budget, which I feel like is another area that can be a little bit daunting or overwhelming, especially for newer filmmakers. We do have a PIC budget template that we require everyone to use. You can download it on that same Media Fund website. And I guess, you know, what kind of tips do you have for people who might be budget weary or less experienced in putting a budget together?
I feel like I'm gonna put like my way back hat on and think about how I approached it. Yeah, as a first-time filmmaker, it is daunting, and you know, it's always a delicate balance between valuing your time and you know, just wanting to move forward with the budget. But I think it's just like, and it used to be that PBS allowed contingencies, and now there's not contingencies in public television budgets, so that gives you a little bit less wiggle room. But also know that, like, I mean, there is a certain percentage that you can move on, like, on line items. So I don't know, it's just, I feel like some of there was one thing that I feel like I didn't know going into it the first time, which is that, like, once you're awarded production funding, I think you have to raise 50% of your budget before the first payment of your PIC money is released. So I think that, you know, because I think people either, especially first-time filmmakers, either wait under budget and are just like, okay, I'm going to get this and move forward, get this little bit of money and move forward, or they like they over budget, and then they're like going into contract, and I mean, that happened to me, where it's like, oh dang, I actually have to raise this money now before I see any money. So it is like, I think by approaching it that way, it helps frame it in like a just realistic kind of way. It gives you a lot of those pieces to think about. Because also, you know, if you under budget, it's going to raise those flags. You know, if you're saying I have, you know, 3 crews and in 3 places or whatever is going on, and you're only budgeting $150,000 for your entire project, that's going to raise eyebrows. And in that section, especially, you're not trying to like raise eyebrows. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not, it's always,
sorry.
It's delicate. It's a balancing act, but that's what I guess a budget is. It's just kind of balancing. I don't feel like that necessarily.
You touched on a bunch of important points, though. One thing that I do want to clarify that you mentioned is for production, we do require 50% of the budget to be raised, and for post, we require 80%.
Okay.
So that is something to be aware of as far as, you know, what other funding sources you're seeking, and we can talk about other fundraising a little bit more later. But
because I think, yeah, and sorry to interject, but like that's a major component of me, at least when I think of budget. It's like I think about timing of the budget. Like in some ways, that's almost more important than the budget itself. And I don't know if that's like a bad producer thing to admit, but it's like cash flow is important.
Yeah, and also, you know, making sure that you've done the research so that you actually feel like you have a good estimate of the figures that you're putting in there. I'm seeing a question just now. What would you say are the usual things that applicants forget to include in their budget? So I'll kind of combine that idea with components that are often misquoted, or where, you know, if people don't actually really do the research, then these figures can end up varying pretty greatly with what the real outcomes are. And, you know, I think it's important to be getting quotes from crew, so you actually know what these services are going to cost. Similarly with equipment rental, you know, you can get quotes for these things that are pretty hard, tangible numbers. Additionally, insurance, I think that's one that a lot of people forget about. Both having general liability insurance and E&O insurance, which there are actually line items for those things in our PIC template, lest you forget them. What are some others? To pay yourselves as your key creative team. I know sometimes it can be really tempting or feel necessary when funds are really tight to forgo paying yourself. But we want you to be compensated for your time and effort in this as well, and your expertise. So yeah, it's to go back to what Christen mentioned. It is a pretty fine balancing act that needs to be informed on real research behind all of these specific items. Kim, I see you nodding.
And adding on to doing research, so for travel, you can obviously look up the cost of airfare, and just don't forget, especially these days, to add like excess baggage fees and select a. I mean, nowadays the fare doesn't include all of the other things that you would need, especially if you're traveling with a crew and gear. So and that can add up. Things like cost of visas, or if there's any other issues like that. So that's something that I think seems small, but it can add up. And you just kind of I will look up a fare, and then I might just pad it a little bit, because obviously fares fluctuate. So if it's like $800, I might actually put in my budget like $900, like not just $800, right? Because then that also might account for the fluctuation and things I don't even think about, like the food on the plane or something.
Yeah, and is because it's true, right? It's a little easier to move within the budget. It's a little easier to move money within a section than it is across sections. So if you kind of are like, oh, there might be some travel things, if we're talking about bumping up and padding and where to, you can be strategic about where you might be overestimating and where you might be strategic about underestimating.
Yes, good point. And a couple other just kind of specific details to our budgeting practices. Let's see, we do allow in-kind services, but we need those to be capped at 15% of the total budget. So that's something to be aware of if you're planning on using a lot of in-kind service from people. We do allow PIC funds to be used to purchase equipment, but that's capped at $500 total for the whole project. One of the reasons behind this is, we know that hard drives are really important to be able to have the data from your filming and all that. We're happy to fund something like that, but we're not going to support the purchase of your new Alexa camera. So that's just something to be aware of when you're thinking about purchasing versus renting equipment. And let me see. Oh, just kind of rehashing what we've talked about before. Many projects will need more than $50,000 to complete. So please plan to fundraise what you'll actually need instead of trying to really go for the bare bones, most shoestring budget, because likely that will get you in trouble eventually, and also it will raise flags if it just seems like a totally unreasonable number for the scope of what you're talking about doing. Okay, is there anything else that comes to mind on budgets? I know that one, there's so many things you can talk about, but really just having as much detail as possible in your budget is super important. Let me see, I see another question over here that says, can the matching funds for production costs come from internal investment, or does it have to come from external providers? You can self-fund the film as well. Producer's cash, as we call it, for your income. So that's definitely an option. and we can talk a little bit more about different fundraising options for what you can pull upon for income or different areas to look once we get to the fundraising section. So we'll circle back to that one. Okay, and that's actually up next. The fundraising strategy and grant impact is our next section that we'll talk about. Which it's pretty straightforward. How do you plan to raise the rest of your funds? And again, being pretty specific here. So, do the funders you're planning to apply to make sense? Do they align with your film and your goals? And then also, the PIC funding that you're applying for, how would this grant be helping you? I think especially right now, fundraising can be a really challenging process. When you're looking, when you're kind of formulating your fundraising plan, where do each of you start in looking for other funds? Like, do you have any specific kind of like resources that you turn to, or how do you begin this process?
Well, I'll just say really quick, like that initial research when you first start out, you might not know the landscape, the documentary landscape, but really, if you just type in like documentary funding, like all the kind of main sources come up for those things. I will say that nowadays those are, and always, they are always very competitive. So like the more, it's usually like a patchwork of like those funds, like the chicken and egg, the Sundance, all those kind of like things that you can easily find on Google. And then like, people are using Kickstarter, usually kind of like later. I think that's more like of a post thing, although people do it earlier. And then, then you kind of got to get creative and specific to your project. It's like, maybe there's a private funder that that's really interested in Samoan literature or whatever, and you can go to that person with your, and that's why having this proposal is helpful, right? Because you can present those materials to those people. But yeah, it's kind of a mix, but I think just in terms of the context of this application, it's like, yeah, you make a list of all the places you're planning to hit up on the hit list, how much cash you're hoping to get, and maybe a little blurb of why that's a good fit and why, where you kind of, what your relationship might be with that funder. If that's helpful, or like signals to the panel, like, oh, okay, like this is a pretty sure, because this whole section is about signaling to the funders, like, oh, okay, like we're not going to be the only ones in on this project because you are going to need more than $100,000 to finish your film. And yeah, I guess that's a short answer.
Yeah, I agree with Kristen. Fundraising is just tricky. Like it doesn't even matter if it's your first film or like 5th film or 10th film. I don't think it really gets that much easier. It depends on your film subject, right, too. So you have to think about what aligns with your film subject. But obviously the main things are, there's all the usual suspects that Kristen mentioned, and like all the documentary filmmakers in the world are going after the same pot of money. And so it's highly, highly competitive. But that's like your Sundance, your Tribeca. If you're in the PBS world, there's the ITBS, right? And then there's other foundations. So think about your subject. If you're doing like a humanities, kind of like a historical film, you can tap humanities funds, like Hawaii Council for the Humanities. If you're doing like an environmental film, there are funds like the Redford Center. So you kind of have to figure out what matches your story, the film you're telling. And then there's smaller like family foundations that might align with your story. You can go after companies, individual donors, right? Then there's crowdfunding. And there's also like equity, which I'm only starting to learn about. I don't know as much about that, but yeah, there's different kinds of funders you can try and reach out and do like international co-productions and pre-sales. So you kind of have to figure out what makes sense with your project, and every project is different.
Yeah, so again, we're coming back to this kind of like consistency piece, and all of the idea that all of these components need to make sense together. So in our fundraising section, you know, we're going to be looking at what is the budget, how much of a budget gap do you have? You know, if you need, you know, over $100,000 in budget gap, you know, you better be like have a few different plans for how you might raise that money, as opposed to, you know, just like applying for one grant and hoping that it comes through. So, you know, we want to see that you, again, have done your research, and are reaching out to places that make sense, as you mentioned, Kim, with your subject matter. So that kind of goes back to your project description in the very beginning. What are some of the key topics that your project touches on, and themes of your project, and who might be interested in funding work about those themes? So it can be a really difficult process, but I think in some ways it can also be an interesting way to think about connection and how you're connecting with people who have an interest in what you're doing and what you're trying to put out into the world.
And maybe let me just add that you can look at films that are similar to yours and check out their credits. So, you know, most films, like, we think all of our films are original, but like you can think about, you know, what other films have been done for me, like about writers or about artists or about Samoan culture, right? And then just like scan their credits and see who funded those films. And then that might give you an idea of where to start for your own film.
Yes, absolutely. That's a good point. Okay, next up we have the work sample. And this is going to be a sample of work not from this project, but from a previous project that you've completed. Ideally, it should be the same genre or a similar genre to what you're proposing, and ideally it should be yours. Like, if you know, if you're the director on this project, then choosing a sample that you also directed would be stronger than choosing a sample that you were an assistant producer on, for example. And ultimately, like, you know, does this sample show us that you'll be able to do what you're proposing here? It's kind of a place where you can show off your chops a little bit, you know, what you've done before and how you've been able to execute a film both aesthetically and from like a storytelling, story arc perspective. So do you, when you're thinking about what work you might want to use as a sample for your application, what are the main things that you're kind of thinking about or weighing up?
Yeah, I feel like for this one, you kind of have to, especially for us both as like, you know, second time PIC filmmakers, it's like kind of have to put back on our way back hats. Cause you know, now it's like, oh, I just submit the film that I already did. But yeah, I think, you know, this is an opportunity to show, you know, maybe that like culturally you're able to present Pacific Islander material in a way that is appropriate, or, you know, that your production value, you know, is you know, on par, because these projects are all intended for national public television, you know, so that's really what this section is for, right? To prove that, like, yes, I'm capable of producing, directing something that is appropriate for national public television, but also hopefully like showing like that, you know, that you have the right kind of sensibility for whatever the project is that you're presenting. So, you know, maybe if your project is like a historical look at, you know, Iolani Palace, you know, even if it's not necessarily a Hawaiian or Pacific Islander project, you know, you can present like a history, like genre type of project, or something like that. But if it's more verite, you'd have to do something more verite, you know, like ideally it's something like that, you know. And then if you have the kicker of like having it already be like culturally relevant to Pacific Islanders, I think that helps as well. But yeah, I don't know. Is that helpful? I hope so.
Yes. Is there anything else, Kim, that comes to mind that Christen didn't touch on?
Not really. I mean, I just think of the genre specifically. I mean, if you have more than one work to choose from, and what kind of best matches the proposed project you're trying to get funding for.
Yeah, that one's pretty straightforward, I think. Okay, we have key creative personnel is our next piece. And, you know, this is where you'll list the key creatives on your project, as well as their bios and letters of commitment as well, so we know that they're actually signed on to the film. And, you know, a kind of like very brief summation of this section is, you know, do you have people on the project who know what they're doing and who have the skills to execute what you're proposing? And, you know, I think, well, what approach do you each have to building your creative team, and do you have any resources for how to connect with other creatives when you're kind of like in the early stages of a project?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Did you hear?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, when you're starting out, you just, you know, you watch films and you see whose work you like. If there's a cinematographer you like, or an editor you like, who has cut a film that's similar to yours or that style, you can just reach out to them. Or start networking. You know, if you don't know them, ask somebody who might have worked with them or whatnot. Sometimes after you've done a few films, you kind of have like a team that you know, like people you like to work with already. So, but I think when starting out, yeah, like just ask people like who they've worked with, you know, what editors they would recommend, what producers, you know, things like that. And then try and get them on board. And sometimes you think like, oh, somebody has had all this experience, they might not be interested in your project, or if you're a first-time filmmaker, but that's totally not true, right? So like, don't let that stand in your way. They might really love the subject of your film. And sometimes, you know, if they are somebody in the industry who like maybe does a lot of commercial work and you think you can't afford them, sometimes they'll have a different rate for documentaries. So, you know, you only know once you reach out to that person. And if they don't respond to you, then just like move on to the next person on your list. But I think a lot of it's research and networking, really.
Yep. Yeah. What was I going to say as well? Oh, I wanted to a little bit get on my soapbox too for like people who are, you know, leading a team that's, you know, if you're like a non-Pacific Islander doing film, you know, obviously a PIC-funded film about Pacific Islanders, there are so many wonderful, beautiful, talented Pacific Islanders, Tongans, Samoans, like all over the place, like not just in Hawaii, like, you know, continentally, you know, obviously in those places locally. So like, I mean, I think if you're somebody based, you know, in LA, you know, and you're looking at filming in Samoa or whatever, think about like using local crew, think about like looking for Pacific Islanders. I'm sure like PIC has a list. And, you know, like I should have looked up it, but there's a good Facebook group of like Pacific Islander filmmakers, producers, cinematographers. Like there's at this point, like a deep bench of like really great Pacific Islanders to like bring onto your project, which like to talk about, I think there's like a training plan, something like that. That this piece, your key personnel can kind of also be paired into that, and like should honestly be paired into that for like PIC-funded work. So that's my piece.
Yes, no, those are great points. And while we don't require the key creatives to all be Pacific Islanders, it does it is something that we look for, that you as an applicant, if you specifically are not Pacific Islander, that you're incorporating people into your project who can authentically tell the story that you're telling, as opposed to from the outsider's lens.
It will benefit your project. It will benefit your project.
Absolutely. And again, like some of the resources you mentioned, I think are really great places to start. And networking, as Kim mentioned, and you can reach out to us at PIC if you're really stumped looking for a producer and you want someone who has like this certain type of experience or specialization. Reach out to us, and if we can help you, then we will.
And I guess I'll say, as a Pacific Islander filmmaker, like on Ninth Island, it's really fun to like have a really full crew of like Pacific Islanders. It's like, and I've been actually on this film, been like, wow, hey, we got the guy from Rapa Nui, we got the Tahitian, it's like fun.
Okay, great. So then, and we'll get to training plan that you mentioned. That is a really good kind of like pairing that you just mentioned in a moment. But before that, we have the audience and distribution. And this one, I think, is an often overlooked piece, or just not always given the importance that I think it deserves. But it is really important. It's essentially asking you to think about why you want to tell this story and for whom. Kind of asking yourself questions like, who will this project matter to? Why will it matter to them? And especially as it relates to Pacific Islanders, because that of what our mission is at PIC. So how do you start to hone in on this question when you're developing your project? And is there a specific type of research that you try to do, or how do you approach this piece?
This is like one of my favorite parts to do, honestly. I love this part. Because it's like, I love thinking about who's going to see it and why they're going to see it. It doesn't necessarily inform the content, but it informs, like the impact, outreach, engagement for a film. And it actually can also inform your fundraising, right? And like, it helps you in terms of making your pitch to a funder. It's like, because people don't want to fund stuff if understanding where that synchronicity or that overlap is between a funder and your audience is like really important, and it helps you like, if you can do that research and pair those things, that's going to make you, in that financing side of things, like a strong filmmaker. And that's like more on the producing side, but it's, it's like matching those things. And being able to talk about, who cares about this, why they're going to go see it, and why people are going to pay attention out of like all the things in the world that you could be doing or watching, and making a compelling case for that to a funder. It's like, that's kind of why this piece exists. So, and it's fun to just like think about like, who's going to see your film, and how are you going to get them to see your film? So I actually really like that part of things. But
What about you, Kim?
And I think, well, since this is for PIC, you want to think about, how your project, will serve the Pacific Islander audience specifically. And if they're within Pacific Islanders, if they're like specific demographics, like in terms of age, culture, geography, things like that. And that goes for all your audiences, right? So you're kind of thinking about who is this project for, and what part of, I guess, the Pacific Islander experience will it illuminate, right? For the audience. So yeah, and then I think locally, I think nationally, I think even internationally. So kind of, yeah, just kind of think about, like, brainstorm, like, who do you want this film to be seen by?
Oh, and then to bring it maybe back down to earth a little bit more, and PIC and PBS focused, like, ultimately PIC is funding your film. It's not a grant, right? It's a what's the word you use? It's a contract, or it's a acquisition. So it's intended, like, once you sign a contract with PIC, your film is like contracted to go to public television. So a built-in audience for you is the PBS audience. And so understanding that audience and understanding how PBS, or like the different strands, that's a whole different thing, but how PBS markets films nationally, just showing that understanding in that section, I think is really, really, like, it just shows that you understand where your film is going to be going if you get this money. And, like, understanding, maybe the audience is, like, it's serving a Pacific Islander audience, but also, like, understanding who the PBS audience is, who maybe shifting, but, is usually, like, maybe older and white, and like what kind of, like, understanding that, like, PBS, like, where a Pacific Islander film might fit into their, like, yearly loop of things, that's a good thing to, like, start getting familiar with, and just showing, like, that you're thinking about that as well.
Yeah, totally. And another component to this that I think it's a good opportunity for some, like, creative thought is the engagement and social impact piece. So we're talking about audience, who's going to see it, who this is for, distribution, how you'll get it out to them, and then also the idea of how you can get people to engage with it in a way that might be a little bit deeper, more meaningful, like community screenings, or kind of creating education materials, or different. People come up with all sorts of really interesting ways to kind of take the film off the screen, if you will, and bring it out into life for people to interact with.
Maybe if I can shout out, like, a good one to look at, I think, like, Kumuhina is, like, a really great example of that, like, thinking about them, like, how to engage people around, like, this idea of mahu, and definitely, like, for those of you guys who aren't familiar with the PIC catalog, like, looking at those films and looking at, like, what makes them good, or, like, like, their distribution strategies, or these, like, extra things, like Kumuhina, I think, just did a really great comprehensive campaign around like mahu, this idea of, like, a place in the middle for, like, non-binary thinking, and all the, like, educational outreach and materials that they had done around that. That's, like, a really great example of thinking through that, like, past the pipeline of television and broadcast, but, like, festival and education and all that stuff.
Yeah, and the film that Christen was mentioning, Kumuhina, you can search information on it on our website, and they have an entire ecosystem of their own materials that you can also check out through their own film website. So that was a great idea. Okay, and then our last piece is the training plan. So as part of our agreement, we do require that you provide specific training opportunities to emerging Pacific Islander filmmakers and crew. And so this piece is really asking, how do you plan to offer that training or mentorship to whom? Like, who are you connecting with and how? And really, most importantly, how will your opportunity create some sort of meaningful, long-lasting support for emerging Pacific Islander filmmakers? How will it help them to the next step in their career? And this also, I think, is it's one of my favorite parts of the application. And this idea that this is an opportunity for you to bring many others up with you and to be training and mentoring as you're creating. So do you all have examples of how you've accomplished this in your current projects or a past project?
I feel like I leapt on first for too many now.
The straightforward way, is you can offer, you can hire, this is more for training, so this is not as much about the key personnel. So offering internships or bringing people on in sort of entry-level positions if they are sort of very brand new to the field. So yeah, talking about where you're going to find those folks and how you're going to reach out and solicit people to come on board your project. But I sort of like to focus more on just like what experiences you'll be offering, right? So like, yeah, you're doing an internship, but what will they actually be doing? And kind of, being honest, like transcribing interviews is something that I have interns do, which I think can be very educational, and it's stuff I do, but like those tasks, but then also like what else can you have them do besides those sort of those entry-level tasks? So like, can they be there at shoots? Can they be sitting in on the edit? Can they be helping with the outreach campaign? So kind of just thinking through meaningful ways that you can create experiences for them to grow and learn, I think is really helpful.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. This is something that I think I'm like, I know that me and Kiara are always kind of like constantly trying to challenge ourselves to be better and better about this because it's important. And just trying to think of new and creative ways. I think one thing though is like finding somebody who's just really passionate and then communicating with them, right, and figuring out like what are they interested in and like really involving them in that process, and like what is that person's goals. You have a lot of there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done and maybe not all of it is fun, but if it aligns with something that maybe there's somebody who really wants to be a researcher or like an archival bless someone who really wants to be an archival intern or like an archival producer. But there's people out there who love to do that stuff or it's just really about like finding what those people want to do and like helping support them and then and I think also like, I mean, and obviously this is informal, but like keeping those connections past like the film, as much as possible. But that doesn't always happen. But
yeah, just adding on to what Kristen's saying, like just really having a conversation, like why do they want this experience on your film project? Like what are their goals and how can what you need align with their goals? So and then that'll help inform. So every internship could be different depending on what they want and what you can provide. And also today too, you can also think, it used to be like all the internships I've had have been in person, but like today maybe you could have an intern who's like remote, right? Especially if they're doing like archival research. So you're not limited by geography sometimes as much as you were in the past.
Yeah, that's a great point. And this piece, I also kind of just like to think, like think back to my former self when you're just trying to get a leg up and to learn and get your feet wet, kind of like what are some ways that you can help someone else out and give them that opportunity. So yeah, I think it's a really great chance to get to incorporate that into a project. Okay, so that covers all of the application pieces. Are there any other kind of more general tips or pieces of advice that you all have for this process that we haven't covered yet?
I guess one thing that I would just want to say overall is like, really just look at what the bullet points and what the things that they're asking for contained in those bullet points, and just, before you send it off, or just constantly, at least that's what I do, just constantly, in filmmaker's statement, explain why you want to tell this story. What is your connection to this story? Why you feel you're the best person to tell this story, and include your access and story to character. That's actually a lot of information that they're specifically asking of you. So like when you see, I think maybe some people see like filmmaker statement and they're just like, oh, here's my place to talk about, whatever my vision. But there's actually, specific questions that are being asked of you within that filmmaker statement. So just make sure that you're really I know this may seem basic, but I know a lot of people actually don't do this, and they feel like, it's just good to really look at those things and make sure you're really directly and clearly answering those questions.
And I think overall, just details are really important. Try and be as specific as you can, as detailed as you can, and also just, show your passion. I think that's one section we didn't really talk about specifically, the filmmaker statement, but that's the one section where you really want to show what your connection to the material is. Funders, they always say they're not just funding a project, they're funding you, right? You're the person making the project, and why you is the big question you want to answer in that filmmaker statement. And you're probably passionate about the story. That's why you're doing this. So just, communicate that passion. Make it personal, I think, for that particular section is where, of all the parts of the application, I think you can get really personal.
For sure. I said I wrote some notes on what to say. And for me, it's that section is the when stuff gets tough on this project and you're with it for 3 years, what's going to be the thing that keeps you going? Because you're going to be with this. You're going to be with this for a while. That's generally how it goes. So, yeah, what's going to keep you going?
Yeah. And to spin off that in a slightly different direction, I think because you end up spending so much time with these materials and this application takes a long time to put together, I think sometimes applicants can end up being a little bit too close to the material. So something that I always recommend to people is, have someone else read your application before you turn it in. A friend or another filmmaker that just to get a fresh pair of eyes on it from someone who has a little more distance to make sure that you are answering all of the questions that we're asking, that the description that you've given of your story and your film, all of the pieces add up and make sense, and there are no little holes missing that in your mind but maybe didn't make it into the page. And then to keep harping on this piece of consistency, that all of the pieces of the application are fitting together and make sense together, because I think sometimes it can be really easy just to be focusing on so many things at once that little details can get missed along the way. So trying not to work in a vacuum, to have a team of people to help you and to give you eyes is a really good idea.
And that reminds me of one thing that I definitely wanted to say with PIC that I'm always grateful for, is that even if you're not funded, you get really nice feedback from the panelists. And it's some of the most helpful feedback, like I feel like, of any other funding entity. Like there's plenty of other and it's relatively rare to even have the chance to have feedback. And I think that it's the way that the feedback is presented. You get like a write-up of your feedback, and somebody goes over it with you. It's really nice. And hey, there may be things that you don't agree with, and that's totally fine. But I think it just always, it's like a great thing about PIC.
I'm really glad you brought that up. So what Kristen's referring to is the panelists who review the projects comment on every component of your application, and we compile those regardless of the funding decision, whether you're awarded funding or not. For everyone, we compile them into a document, and we do give you that information so that you can use it to hopefully strengthen your application. And awarding funding the first time around, like we absolutely encourage you to work on the application and come back to us. There are many projects that we funded who didn't get awarded funding the first time they applied, and then they kept working on it and kept crafting and honing and applied for another round and did get awarded. So don't get discouraged.
I'm just laughing because as about a 500 time apply for my first film, don't get discouraged. Hang in there.
And it worked out.
Yeah, it worked out.
Okay, so I know we've been answering some questions that have come up along the way, but if anyone else, audience-wise, has any other questions, we're here to. You have a question? Okay. And if questions come up later, we actually, as I mentioned, we will be recording this. It'll be up on our website and our YouTube. So if you're watching this later and a question comes up, please feel free to write into us, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible.
There's a new
I
question. I just popped up.
Kristen, did you say you had a question?
Yeah. But Brad has the question. Can we apply for a project that was started a couple years back that we have yet to complete? Can do that one first.
Okay. Can we apply for a project that was started a couple years back that we have yet to complete? Yes, I think I might need a little bit more information on that to answer it fully, but depending on what stage in the project you're in, it doesn't have to be a project that was conceived of like right this moment or 3 months ago. Definitely, assuming that you're applying for either production funds or post-production funds, and that you meet the criteria for our projects and all of that.
So my question was, has there been anything in the past year that's kind of been updated or changed at all with the, because I mean, just me as, yeah. Is there anything that's changed in the past year or two as far as the application or any new updates or things that you would suggest
that is
kind of look out for?
That is a great question. I can only answer that partially, I would say, because I actually just began at PIC last year. So I'm not as familiar with what our specific application requirements were prior to that. I know that our application has evolved a little bit over time, but we are we base much of our application on the I believe it's the IDA Core app. So a lot of the components that you see that we require are fairly common amongst a lot of funders. And so to some extent, I mean, that's also good news. If you're applying to a bunch of different places, many of these components that we're asking you to do, you'll be able to use, you know, maybe with like small tweaks as far as like link requirements, or kind of like specific, you know, mission differences. But these pieces are largely going to be pretty similar to what a lot of different funders are asking for. Okay. Todd asks, you mentioned interns. Do they need to be new interns for the funded project, or can they be existing or new employees? So as far as the training plan goes, it's the purpose of it generally is to be offering opportunities to up and coming filmmakers and or, you know, talent or crew. So so whether so really the focus, as opposed to employment status, like the trainee could be employed somewhere, you know, working in a media related field even, but the idea is that you're offering an emerging Pacific Islander filmmaker an opportunity to kind of like get their feet wet, so to speak, through their involvement with your production. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. But I would say that there's a difference between, you know, having someone on your team as creative versus the people who you would be focusing on training in your training plan. That's not. Those are kind of two different things, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's getting at your question, but feel free to write in if you need to clarify, or you need me to clarify. And I see Cheryl has written in and said, for the most part, our application has not changed. So to your question, Kristen. Yes, but can we put them on Zoom? You can add line items in your budget to for like internship fees, so to speak. Yes. Okay. If that is all the questions, we've been talking for quite a while. Thank you, Kristen and Kim, so much for joining us and for giving us all these nuggets of wisdom. And again, for anybody watching, please refer to that the Media Fund page on our website. Feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any questions. I believe my email was listed somewhere on the chat over there, but it's it's cdillon@pipcom.org. Yeah, feel free to write with questions. Good luck on the application, and thank you both again for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Good luck, everyone.
Yeah.